What's the craziest road you've ever driven on? I'm sure we all have our own answers to this one. I remember the first time I drove in the 401 in that section with the 18 lanes. I think there was at one point I had an 18-wheeler in front of me, an 18-wheeler behind me, an 18-wheeler on my right and one on my left. And it was like going 130 kilometers an hour in a box. It was the weirdest experience. But you know, you can get used to driving on the 401. I remember a really scary experience driving in Palermo in Sicily. I was there about 5 years ago on vacation with a friend of mine, and let's just say that lanes are not a thing in Palermo. I mean, they have the lines painted, but they're general suggestions, that's all. As are traffic signs, you know, they're just mild suggestions and traffic signs. But, you know, even there, I eventually got used to the craziness of it all, and actually found that I became less anxious driving in Palermo than I was driving in Halifax, because I never had to worry about being in the wrong lane. There's no such thing as a wrong lane, no such thing as a right lane. If you need to get off at an exit, you just cut across traffic, and everyone has brakes. And people aren't uptight. So it was quite an experience. So I have to say that the worst experience of driving I've ever had was actually last summer in a rural road in Nova Scotia. Can anyone think of why it might have been a terrible experience? Potholes. That's right. Now, for those of you who are perhaps new to Canada, just, you know, it's the cycle of freezing and thawing. You know, when things freeze, they contract. When they thaw, they expand, right? And so this constant cycle, it wrecks the roads. And we're not the most populous province, so it takes us a while to get around to fixing them. So this road was so bad that I had to go below the speed limit. And you know it's bad when I have to go below the speed limit. If I hadn't, the road would have destroyed my car. The road did not do what it was supposed to do. In the second week of Advent, we're introduced to the person of John the Baptist. This was a first century photograph of John the Baptist that was discovered in an archaeological dig. He's one of the central figures of Advent because he tells us that the Lord is coming. And guess what the word Advent means? Take a wild guess. Coming, that's right. The word Advent means coming. He tells us about the coming of the Lord, and he tells us to get ready to prepare the way of the Lord, to prepare the road. Some translations say prepare the highway for our God, to prepare it, to repair it. He quotes the prophet Isaiah and identifies himself as the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. He says that the crooked ways shall be made straight and the rough ways are to be made smooth. We're to fill in the potholes. This word speaks to us today and tells us what God expects of us personally and as a church. That we too are called to prepare the way of the Lord, that he's coming and he desires that people encounter him. Now, this is week 2 of our Advent preaching series, Divine Expectations. We're at the beginning of the liturgical year, and we're looking ahead at this coming year and saying, what are the major goals we want to aim for this coming year? And our own bishop has called our diocesan church, all the parishes, to aim for growing small groups in their parishes. So with that in mind, we're asking the question, what does God expect of us? What kind of church are we called to be? And last week, you may recall, we looked at the question of caring. And I asked the question, do you think that being a caring church is important? And I'm pleased to tell you that there was great enthusiasm for that concept in all 3 masses. So everyone thought it was a pretty good idea that we should be a caring church, right? Agreed? And you remember we talked about how we were going to do that, that the prevailing model of super priest wasn't going to get us there because there's only one. I'm not even super priest. There's only one of me, and there's like 1,000 of you guys. So this idea that the priest is supposed to personally care for everyone, it's not going to get it. We're not going to be a very caring church if that's the model. Instead, we talked about the need to shift to become like a family with lots of kids, where we actually care for one another. And this is where the idea of small groups comes in. Because literally, unless we move in this direction, and I know that it's not considered normal for Catholics to have that, but unless we move in that direction, we're not going to be a caring church. It's just sociologically, psychologically impossible. So that was last week. Well, this week, we get to hear the voice of one crying in the wilderness. And what does this voice call us to do? Prepare the way of the Lord. Okay, let's try that again. What does this voice call us to do? That's right. I'm glad you're paying attention. It's good. So we're called to prepare the way of the Lord. But let me ask you a question. How can you prepare a road if you don't know where it's going? What is the destination? What are we aiming for in our parish? If we are to prepare a road for people to encounter the Lord. Well, 2 years ago, our parish pastoral council met to pray and discuss this question. And a parish pastoral council is a group of parishioners who gather to help me with the big decisions in the parish. And we discerned the following. We said that we dream that our parish will be the heart of Dartmouth. That's our vision. Now, this is, you could say, a bit vague, but it means many things. It means that the heart is the center, considered often the center. The heart represents love. It represents caring, compassion. The heart is an image of life and nourishment and vigor and even courage. Let me ask you a question. Could our parish be this for our city? Do you think that's possible with God's help? I'm glad to hear it. Because God can do extraordinary things when we prepare the way for His coming, when we seek to become the parish He's calling us to be. At the same time as discerning this vision, we also discerned a core purpose, because there's a lot of things happen in our parish from week to week. It's a very, very busy place, sometimes too busy. And the question we need to ask ourselves is this: when you boil it all down, what's the core purpose? What's at the center of what we do? And this is what the Pastoral Council come up with, and I'm sure many of you have seen this already, that our core purpose, this is why we exist, to make joyful disciples of Jesus who form a community that overflows in faith and charity. Now, in our second reading this weekend, we heard from St. Paul's letter to the Philippians. That is, he wrote a letter to the parish in a Greek city called Philippi. And he said this to the parishioners. He said, "How I long for you with the compassion of Christ Jesus." See, compassion, the heart. And he said, "This is my prayer, that your love may overflow more and more with knowledge and full insight." And I love the image of a pot that overflows, because that's what the Christian life is meant to be. We're supposed to be so full that we overflow, because it can't just be about us. It's the case in our own personal lives. It's the case in a church. A church cannot be just for itself. It exists to overflow and to touch the community around us. Sometimes we get confused. We think that the church, the parish, exists for the parishioners. Perhaps you've thought that the parish exists for parishioners. But that's the definition of a club, right? A club is an organization that exists for the purpose of the people who are members. That's not the definition of a church. Someone once said this, that the church is the only organization that primarily exists for the sake of those who do not yet belong. We're called to be a church that overflows with love. We exist to be a church that prepares the way for the Lord to come to people, that prepares the way for the Lord to come to the people of Dartmouth. In one sense, we've always been doing that in some form or another, but I would like to propose today that there is a major pothole on the road that we've been working with that needs fixing. It needs an adjustment. It needs to be changed because the world around us has changed. We're in a very different world than the world of 40, 50 years ago, and yet so much of what we do still rests on the presumptions of a world that no longer exists. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, some of you can remember 30, 40 years ago. I know some of you can't. But remember 34 years ago, it was a very different world in Canada. And some of you are new Canadians, and you've already realized that Canada is a very different world from the country in which you grew up. 30, 40 years ago, or in the country you grew up in, the values of faith and the values of our culture were not so far apart. They kind of overlapped. And now there are a world apart. In many ways, our culture is at best indifferent to faith and at worst hostile to it. Many Canadians consider faith in church as being completely irrelevant to their lives, and that's actually on us. You see, we need what's called a paradigm shift. Everyone say paradigm shift. Now, do you know what a paradigm is? That's a paradigm right there. Yeah, those are the new dimes. That's the new dime with King Charles on it. That's not a paradigm. A paradigm is, in a sense, a mental or social construct that frames how we see the world. It's in a sense, it's a way of thinking that we just presume. And it shapes how we act in the world. It's a way of thinking that we just take for granted. And so when I say that we need a paradigm shift, we need to take something that we take for granted and turn it on its head. And for example, this is what I mean. This is a bit abstract, but you'll get this. Behave, believe, belong. Everyone say behave, believe, belong. Now, you remember, those of us who are older, do you remember your mother, your father saying, "You behave"? Now, did you know what she meant by that, right? Yeah, because we knew how to behave. We were taught to behave, what good behavior was. For the most part, we knew what to believe because we went to Catholic schools, we went to catechism, it was drilled into us. And if you behaved and you believed, you belonged. That was the traditional pattern of this. But think of our world now that's now a post-Christian world, perhaps even anti-Christian world. If we are going to prepare a way of the Lord for people out there, for the people of Dartmouth, do you think it's going to work if we start with "you better behave"? Is that going to work? No. They'll tell us where to go. Go down to the Dartmouth ferry and take a long walk or something like that. We need to switch this around. Watch this. We need to go whoop and change that. We need to begin with belonging. We need to meet people where they are and build relationships with them, genuine, not fake relationships, genuine relationships. To love and care for people and help people to find a home where they can slowly explore who Jesus is for them and discover the person of Jesus, come into relationship with Jesus and begin to believe in Jesus, begin to trust in him, and then the question of behavior or lifestyle follows from that. That's the paradigm we need to embrace. You see, this is not just the way to Jesus, it is the way of Jesus. It is, not just was, it is the way of Jesus. Think of the gospel stories of all the people he encountered. So many of the people who encountered Jesus were not religious people. They were people who didn't belong, the people who had been excluded, the public sinners and the tax collectors. I think of the woman at the well or Zacchaeus, the story of Zacchaeus. Jesus said to Zacchaeus, "I'm coming to your house for supper." People were shocked. He hung out with them. And Zacchaeus came to believe in him, and then he changed his life. It's the model of Jesus. It works. It always has and it always will. So here's the critical question for us as a church. How do we create experiences of belonging for people who do not yet believe if all we do as a parish is have Mass, Sunday Mass? It's no longer enough. How do we create experiences of belonging for people who struggle to believe or behave? By the way, is there anyone here this morning who sometimes struggles to believe beside me? Oh, come on. Telling lies is a sin. We all struggle, right? We in this, are you kidding out there? I mean, you step out there, people aren't saying, you went to church, good for you. That's awesome. People aren't saying that. They're saying, what? You're weird. Why do you do that? It's a hostile world out there. The things on which we used to survive before are not enough. We need this paradigm shift. Yesterday morning, I went to visit the men's group. It's been gathering a group of men for about 2 years, I think, in our parish. And I had to say, I had an amazing experience just being with about 12 or 13 men. There was a couple of new parishioners who were there. We prayed together, we talked, we shared, we discussed, we explored issues, and of course we drank coffee and ate Timbits. And I left there encouraged. I left there built up. It was an experience of belonging that strengthened my belief. I felt it, and hopefully it will impact my behavior. We'll see. Brothers and sisters, I really believe that the establishment of small groups in our parish, like the men's group or other groups that meet, is going to be essential for our parish becoming a place where people encounter the Lord, who is coming. The experience of that kind of community is going to help us grow in love and overflow in faith and charity. We need to create a new paradigm of parish life because the world has changed. And what we're often still trying to do, guess what? It stopped working 30 years ago. Many of you know this because your children and grandchildren have walked away from the church and even walked away from God. So, prepare the way of the Lord. Here's what I'm asking of you this week. Take some time to reflect on and even discuss these questions. Question number one, how do I experience belonging in this parish? That's a very important question. How do I experience belonging? The question is, do you? Maybe you don't. How do you experience belonging? Do you belong or do you just show up? Do you just attend? And here's a second question, perhaps more important. How have I contributed to another person's sense of belonging? Or is that someone else's job? How have I contributed to another person's sense of belonging? Friends, if we are to be a church that overflows in faith and charity, we need to own these questions. All of us, young and old, new parishioners, parishioners who have been here for 300 years. We all need to own these questions. And to hear this voice that is crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make his path straight. Fill in the potholes so that all flesh shall see the salvation of our God.